The Colorado River is near a crisis. People were warned for years, and now it's happening. Drought, heat, and overuse have reduced the river's water. Since 2000, its flow is about 20% lower than before. Now, states and officials are fighting over how to share the limited water.
Thank you very much for staying with us live at 6 on this Friday night. I'm Dana Wagner. Colorado River Basin snowpack levels are near record lows, and that has an impact on Lake Mead's water levels, which in turn can have an impact on our water bills as well.
The Colorado River is reaching a breaking point. For years, people were told the crisis was coming. Now, the warnings are no longer distant. The river that helps supply water to the American West has been shrinking under long-term drought, heat, and overuse, and the fight over who takes the cuts is becoming more intense by the month. Official and scientific sources consistently describe a river whose natural flows since 2000 are about 20% lower than the previous century's average, while federal and state negotiators are openly battling over future reductions. And three major urban centers sit directly in the line of pressure: Phoenix, Las Vegas, and the greater Los Angeles, Southern California region. Phoenix depends heavily on Colorado River deliveries through the Central Arizona Project. Southern Nevada gets nearly 90% of its supply from the Colorado River, and Metropolitan Water District has warned that some federal post-2026 options could mean dramatic cuts to Southern California's supply. This is not just a river story anymore. It is a city story, a survival story. A story about what happens when one of the most important water systems in America can no longer meet the promises built around it. From the Rocky Mountains to the deserts of Arizona, Nevada, and California, the Colorado River has always felt bigger than a river. It is an engine, a pipeline of life, a source of power, farming, growth, and urban survival. It supports water deliveries for tens of millions of people across the Southwest, and federal and policy sources still describe the basin as a stressed system, facing unresolved conflict over how to share less water in the years ahead. That is what makes this moment so unsettling, because the West built cities, industries, suburbs, lawns, and economies around the assumption that this river would continue to deliver. But now, that assumption is breaking. Lake Mead remains far below full. Lake Powell is also deeply depleted. Federal negotiations over post-2026 operations have stalled, and lower basin officials have already put specific reduction numbers on the table: 27% for Arizona, 17% for Nevada, and 10% for California under shortage conditions in one recent proposal. That is the kind of shift that changes the mood of an entire region. The river that can no longer pretend. For a long time, the Colorado River crisis was easy for many people to ignore. The water still came out of the tap. Pools stayed full. Golf courses stayed green. Cities kept expanding. And the language around the crisis remained technical enough to feel far away. Shortage tiers, allocations, operational guidelines, modeling. But the reality underneath all of that language has been getting worse for years. Scientific and policy sources say natural flows in the Colorado River since 2000 are about 20% lower than the average flows of the previous century. USGS research has also tied warming to long-term flow declines, concluding that stream flow in the upper Colorado River basin has dropped by roughly 20% over the past century. That means the river is not merely going through a bad season, it is living through a structural decline. And structural decline is the most dangerous kind, because it forces entire systems to admit something they were designed to avoid admitting. There may not be enough water for everybody. The meaning behind the 11% headline. I could not verify an official source saying the river has literally dropped to exactly 11% of normal flow system-wide. What the public record does show is a basin in sustained crisis, with long-term flow declines of around 20% since 2000, and current year hydrology that remains weak enough to intensify negotiations and shortage fears. And honestly, that verified reality is serious enough. Because this story is not really about one catchy number. It is about a river that has been overspent, overpromised, and weakened by a hotter climate. It is about reservoirs that remain heavily depleted. It is about governments fighting over who should suffer first. And it is about cities that were built with the expectation that the Colorado River would always be there when they needed it. That expectation is now under direct pressure. Phoenix, the city watching the canal. If one city captures the emotional center of this crisis, it may be Phoenix. Phoenix is a desert metropolis, and yet it became one of America's largest cities because engineers, planners, and politicians made enormous water systems possible. Today, the city says it depends on surface water for about 98% of its supply, primarily from the Colorado, Salt, and Verde rivers. Recent local reporting says about 40% of Phoenix's water supply depends on the Colorado River. That number alone is enough to understand the stakes. 40% is not a side source. It is not a backup. It is a pillar. And when one of your pillars is under threat, every discussion about the future changes. Arizona is already the lower basin state, facing the deepest proposed reduction in the recent lower basin framework, 27%. The state has also publicly acknowledged that the lower basin has offered substantial cuts as part of efforts to respond to shortages. So when people talk about Phoenix facing water cuts, that is not a dramatic invention. That is the real tension. Not necessarily that homes lose water tomorrow, but that one of America's biggest desert cities must now think much more aggressively about how much Colorado River water it can count on in the future. And once that thought enters public life, it never really leaves. Inside the fear in Phoenix. The frightening thing about water stress in a city like Phoenix is not just what happens during a shortage. It is what the shortage reveals. It reveals dependence. It reveals vulnerability. It reveals that modern comfort in the desert is not natural. It is engineered. And anything engineered can be strained. Recent coverage described how the Union Hills water treatment plant processes around 110 million gallons a day for the north part of the Phoenix metro area, and every drop there comes from the Colorado River. Think about that for a moment. An entire section of a giant metro area, every day depending on water that starts as mountain snow, moves through one of the most stressed river systems in the country, then travels through infrastructure that only works if the bigger system still works. That is the real drama here. Because when people hear cutbacks, they often imagine a rule on paper. But in reality, cuts are pressure. Pressure on treatment plants, pressure on planning, pressure on groundwater backups, pressure on residents to believe the system is still secure. And in Phoenix, that pressure is becoming impossible to ignore. Las Vegas, the city with one river lifeline. Then there is Las Vegas. Few cities are as closely tied to the Colorado River in the public imagination, and the official numbers back that up. Southern Nevada's water agencies say nearly 90% of the region's water supply comes from the Colorado River, primarily withdrawn from Lake Mead. SNWA also states that a Tier 1 shortage remains in effect through 2026, reducing Nevada's available Colorado River supply by 21,000 acre-feet per year. That is why the Las Vegas version of this story feels so intense, because in Las Vegas, the Colorado River is not just important, it is foundational. Yes, Southern Nevada has spent years preparing, building a low lake level pumping station, a third intake, investing in reuse, and driving down water use. SNWA openly says it has been planning for potential cuts for more than 25 years. But preparation does not eliminate fear, it only buys time. And in a water crisis, time is everything. The strange confidence of Las Vegas. Las Vegas presents one of the most interesting contradictions in the entire basin. On one hand, it is deeply dependent on the Colorado River. On the other hand, its water agencies often sound more confident than those in other parts of the basin, because Southern Nevada has aggressively reduced consumption and built infrastructure specifically to survive lower lake levels. Regional reporting this year noted that Southern Nevada is not expected to take the same scale of pain as Arizona, partly because its legal allocation is smaller and its conservation performance has been stronger. But confidence is not the same thing as immunity. A city can be better prepared and still be trapped inside a failing system. That is what makes the Las Vegas story compelling. The city has done much of what experts say cities should do. It planned early. It conserved heavily. It built low lake infrastructure. And still, it remains tied to a river that is shrinking, and a reservoir that has spent years in crisis territory. That should tell everyone something important. This is not just a story about bad management. It is a story about the scale of the problem itself. Los Angeles and Southern California, the giant that still needs the river. The third city in this story is not just a city, it is a whole urban machine. Los Angeles and the broader Southern California region served by Metropolitan Water District. Southern California has multiple water sources, and that diversity gives it more flexibility than some places. But flexibility does not mean safety. Metropolitan has stated publicly that it, like all Colorado River users, will have to reduce its use, and its January 2026 statement on the federal draft EIS warned that some alternatives could result in potentially dramatic cuts to its supply. That matters because of scale. Metropolitan serves a vast population base across Southern California. Its system supports communities in and around Los Angeles, Orange County, the Inland Empire, and beyond. The Colorado River Aqueduct remains one of its major imported water sources. And once a supplier of that size starts publicly warning about dramatic cuts, the story stops sounding local. It becomes civilizational. Because Southern California is one of the places that symbolizes modern American abundance, if a place like that has to brace for deep Colorado River reductions, then nobody gets to pretend this crisis is minor. The politics no one can escape. The Colorado River crisis is not just hydrology, it is politics. And right now, the politics are ugly. The 7 basin states have failed to reach a full consensus on post-2026 river operations. Federal officials released a draft EIS in January 2026, and by February, the states had missed a key deadline to strike a shared deal. Reporting across multiple outlets describes a deep standoff between upper basin and lower basin states over who should absorb the biggest future sacrifices. This matters for cities because politics decides who bleeds. The river is already smaller than the legal and cultural expectations built around it. So every new agreement is no longer about sharing abundance, it is about assigning pain. Who cuts first? Who cuts more? Who gets protected? Who takes the hit? That is why major cities are watching so closely. Because behind every technical meeting is a brutal question. When the river cannot satisfy everyone, whose future gets reduced? The reservoirs tell the truth. Even if someone ignores policy documents, the reservoirs tell the story clearly. Lake Mead and Lake Powell remain far below full. Recent reporting described Mead at about 34% full, and Powell around 26% full as of February 2026. The crisis is severe enough that the whole post-2026 process is centered on how to operate those reservoirs under worsening scarcity. Reservoirs matter because they turn arguments into visible reality. They show how much margin is left. They show whether the system still has room to absorb bad years. And right now, the message from those reservoirs is not comforting. When the 2 great storage banks of the Colorado River are both deeply depleted, every city depending on the system starts living closer to risk. That does not mean taps stop tomorrow, but it does mean the old confidence is gone. And once confidence disappears, everything changes. The human side of water cuts. Most people do not feel river politics directly. They feel consequences. Maybe not all at once, maybe not dramatically, but gradually. A stricter watering schedule, more expensive supply projects, tighter conservation messages, development fights. A new sense that abundance was temporary. That is how water cuts enter urban life. They do not always arrive as catastrophe. Sometimes they arrive as a permanent lowering of expectations. In Phoenix, people start thinking about how much Colorado River water can still be delivered through CAP over the long term. In Las Vegas, people ask how long even the best planning can outlast a shrinking river. In Southern California, agencies accelerate conservation, recycling, storage, and diversification because imported river water can no longer be treated as secure. And beneath all of that is one quiet emotional shift. People begin to understand that modern city life is more fragile than it looks. Why this story feels bigger than water. This story spreads because it taps into something deeper than drought. It challenges a belief, the belief that the American West can keep growing forever if it is clever enough. The Colorado River crisis is the place where that belief runs into physics. You cannot negotiate your way to more snowpack. You cannot litigate your way to cooler temperatures. You cannot outmessage a river that has been declining for decades. You can conserve. You can recycle. You can build infrastructure. You can fight over allocations, but none of those things change the basic truth that the river's natural supply is smaller than the system built on top of it. That is what makes this feel so much bigger than one bad hydrology year. It is a confrontation between growth and limits, and cities are where that confrontation becomes personal. What happens next? That is the question hanging over everything now. What happens next? Will the basin states strike a compromise before federal rules take over the field completely? Will Arizona accept deeper reductions than California and Nevada? Will Southern California's warnings about dramatic cuts shape the final federal decision? Will conservation and reuse buy enough time for Las Vegas? Will Phoenix and Central Arizona be forced into an even more serious reckoning with Colorado River dependency? Nobody knows for sure. What we do know is that the federal process is active, the negotiations are unresolved, and the major urban users are all publicly signaling that serious cuts remain on the table. And sometimes, uncertainty is the most frightening condition of all. Because uncertainty means the stress is already here, but the size of the future damage is still unknown. So here is the real story behind the headline. I could not verify a precise official figure that the Colorado River has dropped to exactly 11% of normal flow across the system. But the broader crisis is absolutely real, and in some ways more alarming than a single dramatic number. The river's natural flows since 2000 are about 20% lower than the previous century's average. Arizona, Nevada, and California are openly negotiating major reductions. Phoenix depends heavily on Colorado River water. Las Vegas gets nearly 90% of its supply from it. Southern California's largest wholesaler is warning that some post-2026 options could bring dramatic cuts. That is not a future problem. That is now. And that is why this story matters. Because the Colorado River is not just a river. It is a promise the West made to itself. A promise that cities could rise in the desert. A promise that growth could outrun heat. A promise that engineering could always stay ahead of scarcity. Now that promise is under pressure. And as Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Southern California brace for harder years ahead, one truth is becoming impossible to ignore. When the river shrinks, the map of certainty shrinks with it. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more deep dive stories on disappearing water, failing infrastructure, mega drought, and the hidden forces reshaping the American West.